Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Sharon in New Jersey, Shandor in the Bronx, Paul in Chicago, Yehudit in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Ryan in Jacksonville, Florida, Paul in the house listening to birds, Bella in Florida, Stephen in New Hampshire, Joe in the Inland Empire, Elle is in the house, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome everybody. Quick reminder, no class tomorrow through probably we'll start up again on Sunday. I'm having a surgery tomorrow morning, the same procedure I had 3 weeks ago. That was on that side of my mouth, which is mostly healed now. And now they're going to do this side of my mouth. Oy, I'm not looking forward to it at all. I tried to teach last time. That just was not possible. They open my gums, they make sutures, and then they put this like putty as a dressing over it, and talking a lot, for an hour is just not consistent with healing from that. So probably it'll just be until Sunday. If by Thursday it looks like I can teach on Friday, I will, or after Shabbos. But it's really just better not to push it and let the healing happen. So today's our last class, probably until Sunday. If it's going to be sooner than that, we'll put an announcement on the Facebook page. Okay, our daf today is page 60 here in daf Samech here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. We are working our way through chapter 5, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 8. We've been on an extended digression from the laws of divorce. And basically what's tying all these various Mishnayos together is that they were rabbinic enactments. The first set was for the betterment of the world, and now we're in a set of rabbinic enactments, rabbinic decrees that were created for the ways of peace, to promote peace within the nation, within a community, within a synagogue, within a family, among neighbors, promoting the ways of peace. So where we finished up yesterday, we were talking about that the sages instituted that on Saturday morning, when the weekly Torah portion is being read from the Torah scroll in the synagogue, and 7 people are called up for aliyahs to say a blessing before that, that 1/7 of the Torah portion is read, we call a Kohen first, and then a Levite, and then the other people who, there's Kohanim, the priests, there's the Levites, the descendants of the tribe of Levi, and then everyone else, right? The other Jews are all called Yisrael. Everyone is part of the Yisrael, the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. Okay, so we picked this up at the bottom of page 59b. And the people of Galilee sent a question to Rabbi Chelbo. After them, the question is, after them, meaning after the priest and the Levite are called to the Torah, now we're at the top of 60a, who reads from the Torah? In other words, are we going to have some kind of an established order, since it's an honor to be called to the Torah on Saturday morning? So after the priest and the Levite, are we going to have some kind of a system for prioritizing who gets called next? And an answer was not readily available to him, to Rabbi Chelbo. So he came and asked Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha, who said to him, after them, right, after the Cohen and the Levi, after them, read the Torah scholars who are appointed as leaders, parnasim, of the community. And after them, read Torah scholars who are fit to be appointed as leaders of the community, even if in practice they have not yet received such an appointment. And the sages said that a Torah scholar who knows how to answer any question asked of him is fit to be appointed as a leader of the community. And so the leaders and those who are fit to be leaders, after them, read the sons of Torah scholars whose fathers were appointed as leaders of the community. And after them, read the heads of synagogues, and after them, any person. So the people of the Galilee sent another question to Rabbi Chelbo. What is the law with regard to reading from Chumashim, i.e. scrolls containing only one of the 5 books of the Torah in the synagogue in public. So very interesting. If you've been to synagogue, if you've seen a Torah scroll, you know, Torah scrolls can very much vary in size. A typical Torah scroll, right, is going to be like 2 rods, each rod about maybe this big, right? And then it's just one long roll of sewn together sheets of parchment made from animal hide. And so, you know, it gets unrolled off of one dowel, and then we read it while it's in the middle, sort of facing you, and then it gets rolled up on the other dowel. And that's the way we work through the Torah over the course of the year. And that contains the 5 books of Moses. So the question that they ask Rabbi Chalbo is, well, what if we have mini scrolls? Torah scrolls can be very small, right? Where both dowels are even like the size of my fingers, and the whole Torah is a compact package, but it's an entire Torah. And some Torah scrolls are very large, right? Where each of the dowels on each side maybe, not really much larger than this. You're not going to find a Torah scroll taller than that. That would be a very large and heavy Torah scroll. But what they're saying is there are scrolls that have the same kind of general shape, you know, rolling the parchment from one dowel to another, but don't contain the 5 books of Moses. Some of these scrolls can contain one of the 5 books, and these were known as Chumashim. Right, so the same kind of shape as a Torah scroll, but containing only one of the 5 books. Otherwise written by a scribe, etc. So can we use one of these single books of the Torah, single scrolls of the Torah, just one of the 5 books, can we read from one of those at the public reading of the Torah on Shabbos in a synagogue? Right, that's the question that they're asking him. Can this be done in synagogue in public? Is this permitted, or is it necessary to read only from a complete Torah scroll that has all 5 books of the Torah in it? And an answer was not readily available to Rabbi Chalbo, so he came and asked Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha. But an answer was not readily available to him either. So Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha came and asked the question in the study hall. And they resolved the difficulty from that which Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says that Rabbi Yochanan says. With regard to a Torah scroll that is missing even one sheet of parchment, one may not read from it in public. And this indicates that an incomplete Torah scroll may not be used for a public reading, and so presumably a scroll that only contains one of the 5 books of Moses would not be permissible to read from in public in synagogue. But the Gemara rejects this argument. But that is not so, i.e. this cannot serve as a proof to the matter at hand. There, the Torah scroll that's missing one sheet is lacking part of the matter that it is addressing, as a sheet of parchment is missing from that Torah scroll entirely. But here, in the case of Chumashim, you're not missing any sheets. Nothing is missing at all. It was intended to be one of the 5 books of the Torah, right? It could be Genesis, could be Exodus, could be Leviticus, etc. And that scroll is complete. It's not somehow deficient in what it set out to do, which is just to be one of the 5 books. So we can't learn out from the fact that a Torah scroll that's actually missing a sheet so that it's truly deficient, that we can't read from that. We can't use that as a proof that we couldn't read from one of these sub-books, right? Like a book of the Torah that is a complete book, but is only one of the 5 books. We haven't made a proof for that is not permitted yet. And Rab and Rav Yosef both say one does not read from Chumashim in the synagogue, not because it is deficient, but out of respect for the community. And in fact, this is the practice. We only read, when we have to read Torah readings in shul, in synagogue, we read from a complete Torah that gets open to the correct place. And if that Torah has been rendered incomplete, it's nullified. In other words, if a letter has been erased, if there's some mistake in it, if we discover that that Torah scroll is deficient in any way, then it is not permitted to read from it in synagogue to the community. Now, Bar Rav, including it can't be just a single book of one of the 5 books. That also is not permitted. And Mar Bar Rav Ashi said to handle such a scroll on Shabbos is also prohibited, even to handle such a scroll on Shabbos. And what is the reason for this? One of these, single books as opposed to all 5 books. We can't even touch that on Shabbos. And what is the reason for this? It is because it is not fit to be read. Consequently, it is treated as set aside on Shabbos. And the Gemara rejects this argument, but that is not so. Rather, it is permitted to handle such a scroll, and it is permitted to read from it. And the proof for this is that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish used to read from a scroll of Agadah containing the words of the sages on Shabbos. But such a scroll may not be written. For in principle, the statements of the oral law may not be committed to writing. Okay, so you see we're now starting to get a little bit of field from the question. The original question was, can we use one of these scrolls that only contains one of the 5 books in order to read the weekly Torah portion publicly in synagogue? Answer was no. Now the question is, are we even permitted to touch such a book on Shabbos? Reason, because it's muktzah, right? So what is muktzah? For example, if I had a hammer here, a hammer is muktzah on Shabbos. Because what's a hammer's purpose? Construction. Is construction permitted on Shabbos? No. So since it is intended for in order to do work, and a kind of work that is prohibited on Shabbos, then by rabbinic decree, such items are actually prohibited from even being touched on Shabbos, which is a fence around the Torah, which designed to help us avoid coming to do prohibited work unwittingly, accidentally, because we forgot it was Shabbos. We just noticed that a nail was sticking out of the wall, and just so that, I'm thinking, somebody doesn't want to snag their garment as they walk by it, or here's my hammer, I'll just tap it in. But if I did that on Shabbos, that would be an unwitting violation of Shabbos, because you can't do that on Shabbos. Maybe I did that when I forgot it was Shabbos. So to help us not have those kind of accidents, the sages decreed that hammers and other kinds of tools like that, things that are not permitted, that have no permitted use on Shabbos, are muktzah, and you can't touch them at all on Shabbos. But is such a scroll muktzah? Okay, you can't read from it publicly, but can't you just read it for your edification on Shabbos, just for enjoyment of reading a piece of scripture? Before we get to that question, they're going to say, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon, they had a scroll. It wasn't one of the books of the Torah. Rather, it was a scroll that contained some passages of the oral law. And now that they're talking about the oral law, we're going to discuss the oral law a little bit. What exactly is the oral law or the oral Torah? Is that the same thing, the Torah Sheba'al Peh? Right? Now, the Talmud is certainly part of the oral tradition of Judaism. Right? The Mishna was the original compilation of the oral law that was written down. The original compilation, what was written down. But it had already existed for well over 1,000 years. Well over. So what exactly is the oral law? We know that at Mount Sinai, God gave Moses the written law, right? He dictated to Moses what would be written in the Torah, the written Torah, and Moses wrote all that down, and that's the Torah. And the Torah has not changed since God gave it to Moses at Mount Sinai. We know that the oral law sort of contains within it a kind of a system for learning and examining questions that come up in Jewish history that could not have been addressed directly in the written Torah. And that's why we have a tradition stretching all the way back to Moses at Sinai. And we, as we learn in Pirkei Avos, there's the chain of transmission. God gave it to Moses. Moses gave it to Joshua. Joshua gave it to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly, etc. Then the pairs of rabbis, and they were all responsible for transmitting that oral tradition to the next generation. And in every generation, it grew. These rabbinic enactments, like the ones that we're talking about here, were added to it. But what was the original nucleus? Was it just the fact that God said, you will have an oral tradition? It wasn't only that. God gave certain laws to Moses orally. Like, for example, what is tefillin? That's not defined in the Torah. We don't know from reading the written Torah what tefillin would look like. But basically the requirements of tefillin go all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai. There were a few other laws like that were given orally. And then over time, the oral tradition grew and grew. What was very important about the oral tradition is that it was meant to stay oral. The idea was never that it was eventually going to be written down. It was intended to stay oral and only pass from teacher to student over the generations. And therefore, since it wasn't written down, the only way to get it would be to have a teacher and have the teacher teach it to you. Once it was written down, you could say it became more accessible to a greater number of people, for sure, but the danger of writing it down is that it would lose its dynamic quality, which really can only be explored, in a give and take between teacher and student and between pairs of students. So how did they get around that? As we'll be reading here, when Rebbe chose to write down the Mishna, which is the first time part of the oral law was written down, and he did that because so many rabbis were being killed by the Romans that he was afraid this whole body of law would be lost. But lest it become calcified and ossified as it was written down, it was written down in a very terse kind of shorthand manner where, a lot got written down, but you can't really understand what's in writing in the oral law unless you participate in the tradition as we are doing here, right? My first journey through the Talmud, I did a lot of it alone, reading from the art scroll, but the art scroll itself is like a fantastic teacher teaching it to you with all kinds of sources and elucidation. It's not just like reading the text of the Mishna or the text of the Gemara. And nonetheless, even that is not good to do without a teacher. And thank God, once we moved to this neighborhood, and I'd done it by myself for a while just to be familiar with the jargon, I was able to join a shir where so much of the teacher, when generally in the Jewish world, when you go to a class on Talmud, whether it's Mishnah or Gemara, the teachers, more than every other word from their mouths, will be in either Hebrew or Aramaic. And if you haven't been exposed to it before, it's just impossible to follow. It was impossible for me to follow. But once you acquire enough familiarity with it, by studying it, in my case from the art scroll for a couple of years, then when I went back to a class, the rabbi was still speaking in that jargon, but I could follow it. I try not to, speak in that kind of jargon here, and whenever I use a Hebrew or Aramaic word, I try to translate it right away, because if somebody's visiting us for the first time, I want them to be able to enjoy with us what we are learning here. At any rate, you need a teacher. You need to do this in community, in company. Otherwise, you can really lose so much of what the tradition holds and what it offers. All right, so there's just a little bit of an introduction to what's going on here. The main idea, though, that I want you to remember is that the oral tradition was intended to be oral, and it was not intended to be written down. But they had to write it down because they were afraid it would be lost entirely. And then even when they did write it down, it was kind of coded, and it's not that they wrote everything down. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish used to read from a scroll of Agadah containing the words of the sages on Shabbos. But such a scroll may not be written. So the objection isn't that you shouldn't be reading on Shabbos. The objection is you shouldn't have such a scroll at all because you shouldn't be writing down the oral tradition. For in principle, the statements of the oral law may not be committed to writing. Rather, since it is not possible to remember the oral law without writing it down, it is permitted to violate that law, that you shouldn't write it down, as indicated by the verse from Psalm 119, 126, "It is time to act for the Lord. They have nullified your Torah." Now, this is a very dangerous little verse. It is used from time to time when the sages have no choice but to violate an existing halacha, an existing law, for the purpose of maintaining the law. Right, so we've arrived at a time in history of our situation where in order to uphold God's word, you have to violate one of God's laws. Now, you don't do that as a regular person, right? It really takes the sages of the generation to determine that such a measure is necessary. And he doesn't do it willy-nilly, and he doesn't do it quickly, and he does it in consultation with the other great sages of the generation, etc. But there came such a time when they felt they had to write down part of the oral law in order to preserve it, but also to help them memorize it. And it's interesting, one of the ways that they would write things down, it's not like people had access to ink and paper. Those were very expensive items. And they couldn't just, go down to CVS, buy a notebook and fill it with their notes to help them memorize things. But what they had was wax tablets and a stylus. And I would assume that they could write down a bunch of stuff, help them memorize it, and then heat up the wax. And then it's all gone, right? So it's not permanent writing, but it allows you. I do this myself. When I need to memorize something, I write it by hand, and that helps me to memorize it much more quickly. And I think they did some similar thing. So here too, in the case of a Haftarah scroll, right? So the scroll that is read in synagogue after we finish the Torah reading, every week there's a Haftarah, not half Torah, but Haftarah, which is a selection from the prophets that's read after the Torah service, or as part of the Torah service, but after the Torah portion is read. So here too, in the case of a Haftarah scroll, since it is not always possible to write complete books of the Bible due to the expense, it is permitted to apply the reasoning of, it is time to act for the Lord, they have nullified your Torah. They're sort of changing the subject very quickly. But again, the same idea. You can't read from a Chomashim, which is just a single book of the Torah, in a public reading in synagogue, right? One of the 5 books, you can't use such a scroll for the public reading of the Torah portion. But can you have a partial scroll? Let's say we're reading a short passage. The Haftarah is always a short passage. Let's say it's from the book of Jeremiah, right? So do you need a complete scroll, a complete book of Jeremiah, in order to read a few verses from Jeremiah that comprise a Haftarah portion? Answer, you don't have to write an entire Jeremiah, because synagogues would not necessarily be able to afford to have a complete scroll of Jeremiah and another one of Isaiah and another one of whatever books are used. Ezekiel is used, Kings is used. There's selections Kings is from writings, but there's selections from the prophets for the Haftarahs. And you don't necessarily have to have complete books of each of those prophets in order to read an excerpt from it. Abaye raised a dilemma before, and the reason is not because you don't need to have a complete book, but rather because, practically speaking, not every synagogue could afford a complete book. And so the sages said, okay, you don't have to have a complete book. We do want people to be able to hear the Haftarah portion, even in a synagogue that can't afford to have complete sets of the scrolls of the prophets. Now, Abaye raised a dilemma before Rabbah. What is the law with regard to whether it is permitted to write a scroll containing only one portion of the Torah, one Torah portion, for the purpose of enabling a child to study it? The Gemara notes, let the dilemma be raised according to 2 different views. According to the one who says that the Torah was given from the outset scroll by scroll, meaning that Moses would teach the Jewish people one portion of the Torah and then write it down, and then teach them the next portion of the Torah and then write it down, and continue in this way until he committed the entire Torah to writing. And let the dilemma also be raised according to the other point of view, according to the one who says that the Torah was given as a complete book, meaning that the Torah was not written down incrementally, but rather after teaching the Jewish people the entire Torah, then Moses committed it to writing all at once. What difference would it make that historically the Torah was written all at once, or Moses would teach some to the people and then write it, teach some more and then write it? What difference would it make? What was Moses' procedure for setting down the written Torah? So the Gemara explains the two sides of the dilemma according to each opinion. Let the dilemma be raised according to the one who says that the Torah was given scroll by scroll. On the one hand, it is possible to say that since the Torah was originally given scroll by scroll, so today as well one may write the Torah in separate scrolls. Or, on the other hand, perhaps one should say that since it was ultimately joined together to form a single scroll, it was joined together and can no longer be written in separate scrolls. And let's examine the dilemma according to the one who says that the Torah was given as a complete book. On the one hand, it is possible to say that since it was given from the outset as a complete book, one may not write it today in separate scrolls. Or, on the other hand, perhaps one could say that since it is not always possible to write a complete Torah, one may write it in separate scrolls. So Rabbah said to him, one may not write the Torah in separate scrolls. And what is the reason? Because one may not write a scroll that is only part of the Torah. Okay. Now, you can have little mini scrolls like what's in a mezuzah, which is just a very small selection from the Torah, or what's in our tefillin, very small selection from the Torah. That doesn't violate this precept. What you can't do is create a scroll that is one of the weekly Torah portions, or a scroll that is one of the books of the Bible, at least not for the sake of reading that publicly in synagogue. But Abaye raised an objection to this idea that you can't write partial scrolls from a Mishna in Tractate Yoma 37b, where it is taught Queen Helene, or Queen Helena, also fashioned a golden tablet as a gift for the temple, on which the Torah portion discussing the Sota was written, right? So we just covered that. Right, we just covered that in the previous tractate we were studying, Sota, right? So the suspected adulteress, when she goes to Jerusalem, when the temple is standing, in order to drink the waters of bitterness, water containing a little bit of dirt from the temple floor, and the ink dissolved off a little scroll containing the verses of the Sota. And then if she's innocent, she'll be fine. If she did not commit adultery, she'll be fine. And if she did commit adultery, then this mixture of just a little bit of ink and water and dirt and a little bit of gallwood or something, what was the other? Just to give a little taste of bitterness, because they're called the bitter waters. Certainly not poison. So if she's guilty, then it would harm her, right? But the verses that have to be written on a scroll in ink that dissolves, so a priest has to copy down those verses, and Queen Helena made a golden plaque to hang in the temple so the priest could copy down those verses. Now, the Torah instructs that those verses be written on a scroll and placed in the water. But what were the priests copying from? From this metal plaque on the wall that seemingly had a portion from the Torah. So Abaye is saying, well, you can't make a portion of the Torah as a scroll, but here was on the wall of the temple a portion from the Torah. So how do you explain that? Right, when the priest would write the scroll of a Sota in the temple, he would copy this Torah portion from the tablet so that a Torah scroll need not be taken out for that purpose. And this indicates that it is permitted for one to write a single portion of the Torah. But Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says in the name of Rabbi Yanai, there is no proof from this Mishnah, as the tablet prepared by Queen Helena was not written in an ordinary manner, but rather it consisted of the letters of the Aleph base, i.e. only the first letter of each word was written on the tablet, and by looking at it, the priest writing the Sota scroll would remember what to write. It wasn't that the whole portion from the Torah was written out on this tablet. It was a mnemonic device. It just had the first letter of every word, or the words themselves were spaced out in a way. It served as a reminder, but you could not look at that and say that's one of the portions from the Torah. Now the Gemara raised an objection from a baraisa that teaches when the priest writes the Sota scroll, he looks at and writes that which is written on the tablet, which indicates that the full text of the passage was written on the tablet. But the Gemara rejects this argument. Amend the baraisa and say that it should read as follows: he looks at and writes like that which is written on the tablet, meaning that the tablet just contains reminders, not the actual text from the Torah. The Gemara raised an objection from a different baraisa. When the priest writes, he looks at the tablet and writes that which is written on the tablet. And what is written on the tablet? quote, if a man lay with you, etc., 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 and if he did not lay with you, etc., etc., from Numbers 5:19, the passage of the Sotar. So apparently, according to this Baraisa, the full text of the passage was written on the tablet. And the Gemara answers with, what are we dealing here? The tablet fashioned by Queen Helena was written by alternating complete words and initials. The first words of each verse were written there, but the rest of the words in the verse were represented by initials. Therefore, this contribution of Queen Helena does not resolve the question of whether writing a scroll for a child is permitted. The Gemara comments, the question of whether or not writing a scroll for a child is permitted is subject to a dispute between Tanaim, as it is taught in the following Baraisa. One may not write a scroll containing only one portion of the Torah for the purpose of enabling a child to study, but if the writer's intention is to complete the scroll, then it is permitted. And Rabbi Yehuda says, in the book of Genesis, he may write a scroll from the beginning until the generation of the flood. In Torah's Kohanim, meaning the book of Leviticus, he may write a scroll from the beginning until, and it came to pass on the 8th day. So you can't write too much, right? So then it starts to become like an incomplete Torah. But for educational purposes, you can do certain selections. The Gemara comments, the question of whether or not the Gemara returns to discuss the previously mentioned dispute. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Bana, the Torah was given from the outset, scroll by scroll. As it is stated, then I said, behold, I come with the scroll of the book that is written for me. Psalm 40, verse 8. And King David is saying about himself that there is a section of the Torah, the scroll of the book, that alludes to him, i.e., that is written for me, as if he, the first king with a permanent throne in Jewish history, as opposed to Saul, who was the actual first king, but David's throne endured. And although David himself is not mentioned in the Torah, but the Torah does mention about that when you establish a king for yourself. And so David finds an allusion to himself and his throne in the Torah. Where am I? No. So King David is saying about himself that there's a section of the Torah, the scroll of the book, that alludes to him, that is written for me. So this indicates that each portion of the Torah constitutes a separate scroll. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says the Torah was given as a complete book, not scroll by scroll. Moses wrote it all at once. As it is stated, take this scroll of the Torah, Deuteronomy 31:26, which teaches that from the outset, the Torah was given as a complete unit, further evidence that we cannot make sub-Torahs, subsets of the Torah. If you're going to set out to write a Torah, you write a complete Torah. So the Gemara asks, and according to the other sage, Rabbi Yochanan as well, isn't it written, take, indicating that the Torah scroll was given whole? How does he explain this verse? And the Gemara answers, that verse is speaking about the Torah after it was joined together to form a single unit. And the Gemara asks, and according to the other sage, Reish Lakish as well, isn't it written with the scroll of the book that is written for me, indicating that the Torah was given scroll by scroll? How does he explain this verse? And the Gemara answers, that verse teaches that the entire Torah is called a scroll. And this is indicated in another verse as well, as it is written, and he said to me, what do you see? And I said, I see a flying scroll, from the prophet Zechariah. Alternatively, this verse serves to allude to the sections of the Torah discussed in that statement of Rabbi Levi. As Rabbi Levi says, 8 sections were said on the day that the tabernacle was erected, on the 1st of Nisan, the Hebrew month of Nisan. And they are the section of the priests, Leviticus 21:1 through 26, 21:1 through 22:26, the section of the Levites, Numbers 8:5 through 26, the section of the impure, Leviticus 13:1 through 14:57, and the section of the sending away of the impure, Numbers 5:1 through 4, and this section beginning with the words after the death, Leviticus chapter 16. Now we're on page 60b. The section dealing with the priests, and the section of the lamps, and the section of the red heifer, as all of these sections are necessary for the service in the tabernacle. Now the Gemara continues its discussion concerning the writing of the Torah. Rabbi Elazar says the majority of the Torah was transmitted in writing, while the minority was transmitted orally. As it is stated, I wrote for him the greater part of my Torah, they were reckoned a strange thing. Hosea 8:12. meaning that the majority of the Torah was transmitted in written form. So you stop and ask, well, wait a minute. I know what the Torah looks like. This is a Chumash, right? This is just the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, with a bunch of commentary on it, Rashi and Rambam and a bunch of other commentators. But this one volume is the Torah. Without the commentary, it would be much thinner. The Talmud, the Art Scrolls, 73 volumes. The Quran over here, 60-some volumes. Seems like the Talmud is much larger than the written Torah, isn't it? And of course the answer is the Talmud grew in the 3,000 years since the Oral Torah was given. So when God gave Moses the Torah, most of what God gave to Moses was in writing, and a small number, a few laws, were given orally, along with a system for asking questions. Right? It was just like the core. God knew very well that what he was giving was a seed that would grow into a magnificent and enormous tree over the centuries. So let's continue here. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no. The majority of the Torah, even at the beginning, was transmitted orally, al peh, while the minority was translated in writing, as it is stated with regard to the giving of the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, Exodus 34:27, for on the basis of al pi, right? So al pi is translated as on the basis of, which sounds similar to al peh, which means orally, right? So for on the basis of al pi these matters, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel, which indicates that the greater part of the covenant between God and the Jewish people that was created in Mount Sinai was taught orally. And the Gemara asks, and according to the other sage, Rabbi Yochanan, as well, isn't it written, I wrote for him the greater part of my Torah? How does he understand this verse? And the Gemara answers, this verse is not a statement, but rather a rhetorical question expressing bewilderment. For did I write for him the greater part of my Torah? In that case, they, the Jewish people, would be reckoned as strangers, meaning that there would be no difference between them and the nations of the world if everything was written down. Rather, the majority of the Torah must remain an oral tradition. And that's very interesting, right? Because we know that the Bible, right, especially the first 5 books, and then all the rest of Scripture that comprise the Tanakh, right? So this is a Tanakh with very little commentary. This is just the Bible, right? So this is the Torah. It's called Tanakh because it's the Torah, the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings, right? That's what makes the Tanakh, and that's the Hebrew Bible. Well, the Hebrew Bible has become available to the whole world. The whole world can read the Bible. In fact, the Hebrew Bible was incorporated almost in its entirety, I believe, into the Christian Bible, right? And there's many more Christians in the world than Jews, right? And so they have full access to the Hebrew Bible. But unless you're learning in a situation like this, which is a little bit unusual, permissible, but a little bit unusual, you're not getting the full Bible, And obviously the Christian tradition, Bill can speak to this much better than I can, but the Christian tradition has its own traditions of commentary and interpretation and ways to understand what's written in the Bible. But if you develop that in the absence of the tradition of the sages, so you're missing a lot, right? You're missing a lot, because even what's in the written Torah and in the rest of the written Tanakh can't really be understood as it was intended, as it was transmitted to the Jewish people, either by the Torah at Mount Sinai or through the prophets in later times. Without passing through this lens of the oral tradition, which was a unique gift to the Jewish people. We can share that, right? We can share that, and we're doing it here. I checked with a rabbi before
teaching this class, because it was a question, can it be taught publicly? And it can, but you really have to learn it from, I mean, you're learning it from me, I'm learning it from Rav Steinsaltz and from my teachers that I learn with all the time. And they're learning it from the great sages, over the generations, right? So we wouldn't just make up our own interpretations. You have to be part of this tradition. You can add to it. You can say what it means to me. You can make suggestions. Everybody is not only welcome to, but it's beautiful when people add their own interpretations, but they have to source their interpretations. And if it's a novelty, if they're just saying something new, it comes from me, you have to say, this is coming from me, right? I offer this, it's something that I thought of. But generally speaking, in our tradition, before you listen to what somebody is contributing on their own, you want to know what their perspective is, right? And so definitely whenever, the normal way to offer a Torah writing about the Torah or teaching or a sermon about the Torah or about script, Tanakh, is to say, well, so-and-so said such and so-and-so said such and such, and they found a difficulty here, and Rashi said this, and Rambam said this, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe said this, and Rabbi Nachman said that, and it strikes me that, right, but you would always start with sources, right, and one is not going to be so arrogant as to offer their own novelty without rooting themselves in the sources. Okay, so let's just get back to what it says here. So the question they're arguing now is, how big was the oral tradition when it was originally given? Was it the original oral tradition, the first little set of oral laws that God gave Moses? Was that more? Were they greater? Were there more laws and more words and more volume, or less than the written Torah? That's what they're arguing about right now. Okay, so the Gemara asks, and according to the other sage, Rabbi Elazar as well, isn't it written, for on the basis of these matters, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel? How does he understand this verse, which says al pi, and suggests al peh, that a great part was given orally? And the Gemara answers, that verse, which indicates that the covenant was based on that which was taught by oral tradition, is stated due to the fact that it is more difficult to learn matters transmitted orally, but not because these matters are more numerous than those that are committed to writing, right? The oral tradition is very challenging to master. It's difficult. You have to labor in it. You have to toil in it in order to make any progress at all. That's why it was said to be bigger. It doesn't necessarily mean that more laws were given orally at Sinai. Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani, the disseminator for Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, expounded as follows. It is written, write you these matters. And it is written later in the same verse, for on the basis of these matters. So how can these texts be reconciled? They mean to teach matters that were written, you may not express them orally, al peh, and matters that were taught orally, you may not express them in writing. So that's a source for why the oral tradition was never meant to be written down, and wouldn't have been but for the Roman persecution. The school of Rabbi Yishmael taught the word these in the mitzvah recorded in the verse, write you these matters, is used here in an emphatic sense. These matters, i.e. those recorded in the written law, you may write, but you may not write halachos, i.e. the mishnayos and the rest of the oral law. And Rabbi Yochanan says, the Holy One, blessed be he, made a covenant with the Jewish people only for the sake of the matters that were transmitted orally. But al peh, as it is stated, for on the basis of al pi, these matters, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. Meaning that what was said before, that the written Torah was for the whole world. Even though most of the laws in it only apply to the Jews, it was understood from the outset, as God created this, that because it was in writing, it would be shared with the whole world. The Torah was a gift to the whole world. But the oral tradition was for the Jews, right? That was for the Jews. Now, the Mishnah teaches that the sages enacted that a joining of courtyards. Now we're back to rabbinic enactments that were made for the ways of peace. Our Mishnah, right, number 8 here in chapter 5, teaches that the sages enacted that a joining of the courtyards in Erev is placed in an old house where it had been regularly placed on account of the ways of peace. Meaning, you join courtyards so that you can carry from one to another, carry objects on Shabbos, which you ordinarily would not be able to do even from private domain to private domain unless they were joined into adjoining of the courtyards. And that's done by an Erev. We call it an Erev, when we have an area of a city, let's say, cordoned off so people can carry there. But what the Erev actually is a meal, enough food for a meal, placed in a basket in one of the homes in that joining of the courtyards. Which home are you going to use for that? Lest people argue that, well, it's honoring one of the people who live in this neighborhood, and who are we going to honor, him or him or him or her or her or her? Whose house are we going to honor? Well, if it's been somewhere, for many years, you don't move it from there just to promote peace. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason for this? If we say that it is to show respect to the owner of that house, but wasn't it related about a certain charity box, which was fashioned for the benefit of the community and brought honor to the person in whose house it was placed? And that initially it was placed in Rav Yehuda's house, and then they moved it to Rabba's house, and then it was transferred to Rav Yosef's house, and then it was moved to Abaye's house, and afterward it was moved to Rava's house. And this teaches that there is no issue here of respect, and that such items would ordinarily be moved from place to place. Rather, instead that the sages instituted this enactment to avoid arousing suspicion, since the Erev had regularly been placed in one particular house. If it were moved to someone else's house, people might think that the residents of the alleyway suspected that the owner of the house was stealing from them, and therefore they want to move it. Lest gossip like that gets started, they just say, leave it where it is. Once it's established in one place, leave it where it is. And there's definitely a sort of a bias for keeping things as they are in the Jewish world. And this may be, one of the reasons for it. We tend to sit in the same seat in synagogue. Very often if one guy tends to do Hagbah, lifting the Torah on Mondays or Thursdays, he very often gets called to do the same job. And it's not to say that he has to be, or that we might not want to honor other people, but we tend to do things as it's done, quickly establishing a tradition, and that's the tradition until there's a reason to change it. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is because if you change it for no reason, people will start to imagine a reason, like there was something wrong with that guy and you took it away from him. So if we're going to make a change, everyone needs to know what the reason for the change is. Now, the Mishnah teaches that the sages enacted that the pit that is nearest to the irrigation channel, again, another enactment for the ways of peace, that a pit nearest to an irrigation channel that supplies water to several pits or fields is filled first on account of the ways of peace. It was stated that the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, disagree about the following issue. When people own fields along a river and they irrigate their fields with water that is redirected from the river, who among them enjoys first rights to irrigate his field? And Rav said the owners of the lowermost fields drink the water, i.e. they irrigate their fields first. And Shmuel said the owners of the uppermost fields drink the water first. Meaning the uppermost fields are the ones that would have the water flow by them first, right? And so they redirect their fields and then they let it go back into the channel, and the people further downstream can get theirs irrigated. Or you might say, no, let the people down at the bottom do their fields first, and then the upstream people can redirect water into their fields, at which point the stream will get much smaller and the people downstream won't be able to irrigate, right? And so the Gemara explains, with regard to a case where the water flows on its own, everyone agrees that whoever wishes to irrigate may do so as he wishes. Where they disagree, it is with regard to a case where they need to dam the river and irrigate through channels. And Shmuel said the owners of the uppermost fields drink the water first because they can say, we are nearer to the river's headwaters. And Rav said, no, the owners of the lowermost fields drink the water first because they can say, let the river go its natural way, and after we take what we need, then you can dam it upstream so that you guys can get water into your fields. And we learned in the Mishna that the sages enacted that the pit that is nearest to the irrigation channel that supplies water to several pits or fields is filled first on account of the ways of peace. And this teaches that the party who is nearest to the water source gets first rights, and it supports Shmuel's opinion, and it is difficult for Rav. And Shmuel interpreted the Mishnah in accordance with the opinion of Rav. And the Mishnah refers here to an irrigation channel that passes the mouth of the pit, so that the pit fills with water on its own, even without damming. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, what is the purpose of stating this? It is obvious. The Gemara answers, lest you say that the owners of the other fields can say to the owner of the pit, no, close off your pit, dam your pit, as well, so that the water not enter it. And we irrigate irrigate your fields in proportion, just like the rest of us. And the Mishnah therefore teaches us that the owner of the pit is not required to do this, and consequently, his pit is filled first. Without getting too much into the technicalities of this, the sages just decreed something that was a very important issue, right? River water irrigation to farmers in an agrarian society where you could easily see that they would start to argue about it. They made a system. They said, okay, people nearest the river get the water first. They take what they need. Okay, then they stop taking the water and the water goes its way to the next person in line. It really doesn't matter which system you use. Everybody's going to get irrigated. But by having a system, there's going to be less fighting and arguing among the people. So this promotes the ways of peace. Rav Huna bar Tachalifa said, now that the law was stated neither in accordance with the opinion of this sage, Rav, nor in accordance with the opinion of that sage, Shmuel, whoever is stronger prevails. Since the law has not been decided, the court refuses to judge the case, and he leaves the claimants to settle the matter themselves in the hope that the rightful party will exert himself and prevail. Rav Shimi bar Ashi came before, they couldn't decide, right? The idea was to have a system so they wouldn't be fighting, but if the sages themselves couldn't work it out, well, then they didn't really do anything, did they? Rav Shimi bar Ashi came before Abaye and said to him, Master, set a time for me to come and study with you. This is an incident, and you'll see why this touches on this issue of irrigation. Right, so Rav Shimi bar Ashi came before Abaye and said to him, Master, set a time for me to come and study with you. Abaye said to him, I'm sorry, I have set a time for myself, and I cannot devote it to you. I need my own time for studying. Rav Shimi bar Ashi said to him, well then, my master, set a time for me to come at night, so we can study together then. Abaye said to him, I have to bring water at night with which to irrigate my fields. So Rav Shimi bar Ashi said to him, okay, I will irrigate for Master during the day, and then Master can set a time for me at night to come and study with him. And Abaye said to him, very well, that is an acceptable arrangement. So what did Rav Shimi bar Ashi do? He first went to the owners of the uppermost fields, and he said to them, the owners of the lowermost fields drink the water first, in accordance with the opinion of Rav. And he then went to the owners of the lowermost fields, and he said to them, the owners of the uppermost fields drink the water first, in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel. In the meantime, while the owners of the upper fields and the lower fields were arguing over who has the first rights to the water, and it's an interesting argument, the way he made it to them is that the people who were in the upper fields were saying to the people in the lower fields, you guys go first. And the people in the lower fields were saying to the people in the upper fields, no, you guys go first. Not I go first and he says I go first, but you go first. No, you go first. Right? So at least they're arguing from a place of sort of generosity and politeness. But really what they're doing is just following the law as it was told to them by this Rav Shimi bar Ashi. Now, why would he give these conflicting rulings? I mean, there are conflicting rulings that Rav and Shmuel didn't work it out between them, but why promulgate this dispute by telling people who are now going to argue with each other both rulings? What did he gain by that? Well, while they were arguing about it, Rav Shimi bar Ashi dammed the river and he irrigated Abaye's fields. So he got that done. Then I guess the people worked it out. And meanwhile, Abaye's fields were irrigated, so now Abaye had time to sit and learn with Rav Shimi bar Ashi. So this sounds like maybe, not the best use of the crown of Torah, right? Because Rav Shimi is really, what he wants is to have time with his teacher to learn, and he's using, the fact that he knows more than the farmers to trick them a little bit. So how is this going to work out? When he came before Abaye, the latter said to him, you have acted for me in accordance with two opposing opinions. And Abaye would not even taste the produce of that year because he thought that the water had reached his field in an unlawful manner. So you can imagine that Rabbi Abaye, right, that Abaye concludes that this job that you did for me, bringing the water to me, now I can't use my fields at all. And you can imagine that he wasn't going to be very happy to sit and learn with Rav Shimi either. So I think probably Rabbi Shimi never did such a thing again. Now, it is related that there were certain residents of a place called Be'harmach who went and dug a channel at the head of the Shanvata River in order to divert the water and allow it to circle their fields, and then they returned the water to the river further downstream. Those who owned the fields further upstream came before Abaye and said to him that this work that they did downstream damages our river, as the water is not flowing as it once had. Abaye said to them, dig a little deeper with them, and that should solve the problem. They said to him, if we do that, our pits will become dry. Once Abaye heard this, he said to the residents of Behar Mach, go remove yourselves from there and dam the diversion that you made for the river. That's how they worked it out. Now the Mishnah teaches taking animals, birds, or fish that were caught in traps belonging to another person is considered robbery on account of the ways of peace, meaning it's robbery by rabbinic enactment, not by Torah law. Why? It sounds interesting, like because somebody sets a trap, they went to the trouble of setting the trap. Obviously, any animal that gets caught there belongs to the trapper. Okay, but he hasn't acquired the animal yet. So it's only when he acquires the animal and brings it into his own domain that it fully becomes his by Torah law. But by rabbinic enactment, if you take somebody else's animal out of a trap that they set, you have committed robbery. Now, Rabbi Yosei says that this is full-fledged robbery. It's not just by rabbinic enactment that taking an animal out of a trap that somebody else set is robbery. By Torah law, it's robbery, says Rabbi Yosei. With regard to nets and woven traps, everyone agrees that since they are receptacles that hold the fish or the animal entering, by right, the trapped animals belong to the owner of the trap. When they disagree, it is with regard to a fish hook or other traps that merely catch the fish or animal, but are not receptacles that hold the animal. In such cases, there is reason to say that the owner of the trap does not take possession of the trapped animal, and therefore another person who takes it is guilty only of robbery on account of the ways of peace. We're on 61a just briefly so we can finish the discussion of Mishnah number 8. Then I'll get to questions and comments. And the Mishnah teaches taking a lost item found by a deaf, mute, an imbecile, or a minor. This is considered robbery on account of the ways of peace. Rabbi Yosei says full-fledged robbery. Rav Chisda says that Rabbi Yosei means that it is full-fledged robbery by rabbinic law, but not by Torah law. The Gemara asks, what difference is there between full-fledged robbery by rabbinic law and robbery on account of the ways of peace? And the Gemara answers, if it is full-fledged robbery by rabbinic law, the victim of robbery can recover the property from the robber by appealing to judges, i.e. the court can expropriate it from him by force. The Mishnah teaches that if a poor person gleans olives at the top of an olive tree that are and the olives fall to the ground beneath the tree, then taking those olives that are beneath it is considered robbery. A sage taught if a poor person gathered the olives and placed them in his hand before they fell to the ground, then it is full-fledged robbery because the poor person had already acquired legal ownership of the olives when they were in his hand. Right? If he's just beating the tree with a stick and the olives fall on the ground, you could see why you could argue, well, he hasn't really acquired those olives yet, even though he did the work of knocking them off the tree. But for the ways of peace, by rabbinic enactment, it is robbery to pick up olives that somebody else knocked off a tree. The Gemara relates that Rav Kahana was once walking to the city of Chuzal when he saw a certain man who was throwing sticks at a palm tree and dates were falling to the ground. And Rav Kahana went, gathered up some of the dates and ate them. The man said to Rav Kahana, see, master, that I threw them down with my hand. I.e., the dates were already in my hand, and therefore they are legally mine. Rav Kahana said to him, you are from the place of Rabbi Yoshia, who was a great sage in the city of Chuzal. And for that reason, you are knowledgeable in Jewish law and halacha. So Rav Kahana read the verse about Rabbi Yoshia, and a righteous man is the foundation of the world. Even after his death, Rabbi Yoshia left a foundation for the world as the city continued as a center of Torah study. And finally, our Mishnah teaches that one does not protest when poor Gentiles come and take gleanings or forgotten sheaves and the produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor, peah, although these gleanings, leavings, corners of the field are meant by Torah law exclusively for the Jewish poor. But we let Gentiles take these leavings also for the ways of peace. And similarly, the sages taught in a Baraisa, Tosefta 5:4, One sustains poor Gentiles along with poor Jews, and one visits sick Gentiles along with sick Jews, and one buries dead Gentiles along with dead Jews, and all of this is done on account of the ways of peace to foster peaceful relations between Jews and Gentiles. Now, that doesn't mean that you bury Jews and Gentiles in the same section of the cemetery. Jews are buried among other Jews, either in their own cemetery or a Jewish section of the cemetery. But if you come up and find several bodies, like say there was some kind of a tragedy, a disaster, or something like that, then as a Jew, you're obligated to bury the Jews, and you bury the Gentiles also to promote peace between Jews and Gentiles. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let's take a few comments and questions. So Bell says, what about the various Megillas? The Scroll of Esther, for example, is of course from the Tanakh and is read on its own in every synagogue I've attended. Just so, right? And so that is permissible. This is one of those discussions that we encounter in the Talmud, which doesn't really finish, it doesn't really show us where the discussion and where the law ended up. I mean, obviously you can print portions of the Torah. Printed books are considered something else. But Bell is referencing a Megillah, an actual Megillah, which is how most people, if they have the means and if they're lucky to have this in their family, will read the Megillah. We don't have one in our family yet. So on Purim, we'll usually just have a printed Megillah. But a lot of people have a beautiful, parchment, handwritten, hand-inscribed scroll of Esther that they use to follow along when the Megillah is read. So there you have, it's not the whole Tanakh, but it is a complete book, right? So that was the issue. The Megillah of Esther, and Megillah is the complete book of Esther. The problem would be is if you, in scroll form, only did, one chapter of Esther. That would be problematic, and that would certainly not be permitted for a public reading. Peggy, how were they able to write on metal? I think what they're saying is, like hammered out, like with a chisel, like it was engraved. It was engraved in the metal. Sharon, isn't it understood that V'zos HaBracha is a singular song that was written to be sung singularly? So you're talking about the brachas that Moses speaks at the end of Deuteronomy, and that you're saying that there are scrolls that contain just that passage. I'm not sure what you're asking, right? Because I haven't seen a scroll like that by itself, and I certainly haven't seen that read publicly, so I'm not sure what you're referring to. Send me an email and we'll discuss it when we rejoin. Okay, so my friends, no class tomorrow because I'm having a surgery, and then I will not be able to teach for the rest of the week. So most likely we're not going to be gathering again until next Sunday, and either on that day or in the days after, we'll do a highlights show and get caught up. Right now, we've been running 2 days behind the Daf Yomi cycle, so after this, we'll be about a week behind, and we'll have to do some catch-up shows and do some highlights of a few pages in a row to get ourselves back on schedule. It's always great to be learning with you. I'm going to miss you for these days, and I look forward to our class gathering again, most likely next Sunday. If we can get together sooner, we'll announce that on the Accidental Talmudist Facebook page.